Hello, everybody. And have you been keeping Neos? Have you been keeping Neo successfully? And maybe you want to try the next step. Maybe you're addicted to shrimp keeping like I am, and you want to try the next level up, which would be Caridina shrimp. So it took me a year and a half with the help of some mentors, but I think I finally figured it out, mostly. At least initially anyway. We have lots of little baby shrimp everywhere, all over the tank. So I'm going to tell you guys all I know. And I want to give a special, huge shout out thank you to Mark from Mark Shrimp Tanks, Leon at Shrimp Mania, and Raffle at Cry More Shrimp. These three guys have helped me so much. And so I finally have a tank breeding out and doing good. So let me tell you what I know. So if you've been keeping Neos, once you get Neos down, Neos are pretty easy. For me personally, I'd been keeping planted tanks for 15, 20 years. And then 8 years ago, I was like, I'm going to dedicate a couple tanks to shrimp. So I got me a couple sets of Neos, and boom, instantly, hundreds of shrimp. They're luckily, because of my aquarium experience, there was no learning curve as far as making more and getting them to do good and live. And then as the years went on, I just focused entirely on breeding and selectively breeding them, calling, that kind of stuff. Well, then I got to the point where I wanted to try Caridina. I finally felt like I had the time and the energy and the resources to give it a go. And so I finally did with some red fancy tigers. The biggest difference, obviously, is that Neos, as long as you give them a nice, stable environment, they're not too picky. They will breed and do awesome in almost anything. For me, all I use is tap water for my Neos. Now, with Caridina, you will definitely need an RODI unit and some shrimp minerals. Let me show you what I use. So essentially, an RODI unit takes your tap water and strips it everything out, strips it down to zero. But you can't just have shrimp in absolute zero water. Nothing can live in zero water. Everything needs minerals. So we add in just the minerals that our shrimp will need in their water. And this is what I use. Now, I know for me personally, when I got into it, the thought of making my own water, not it just don't come out of the tap, seemed a little bit intimidating, but really it is not. You take your RODI water and you slowly add your minerals in, the salt, the salty shrimp, and this is a TDS meter. Now, a lot of people say anywhere from like 70 TDS to 150 TDS for Caridina. Now, I am in the group of people that think a little bit higher is better because then they have plenty of calcium to make their molts and that. So I aim for anywhere around 130 to 150, usually like 135, 140 is where I end up at. In fact, let's see what this tank is testing at now. We are right around 140, just as I hope and plan for. So not only do we need to worry about making our own water, we've got to worry about stabilizing and keeping the pH low. And that is done with the use of shrimp soil, shrimp substrate, goes by many names. There are tons and tons of options out there, but really, there's only a handful that people really prefer. And the best one ever made ADA Amazonia is now discontinued because they dug all the soil from where they was getting it at. So a lot of people are all up in arms of people who can only breed in Amazonia. So this part is really a really tricky part because a soil that doesn't work or a soil that sucks can, even though you do everything right, you're not going to have results. So being in the US, I have had great luck with Brightwell. Rio Escurio F, I think, yeah. The fine. There's also an XF, extra fine. And what that means is since Caridina tanks should have 0 kh, that means we use the soil to buffer the pH down. And you want your pH anywhere between 5.5, and once you start getting over 6, it's time to start thinking about changing it out. That's another thing that can be a pain in the butt. Most soils will work for about a year, maybe a year and a half, 2 years, depending on the soil and how you're using it. Now, you'll see here that I have a special UGF filter that is full of the shrimp soil, and just a little tiny bit just to barely cover the glass on the bottom. Now, there's people that like both ways, there's people that prefer one way or the other, but the gist of these Asian style UGF filters is that you can use a whole lot less soil for the same size tank because the water, you see down there, there's a space, and that lift tube is pulling water directly from underneath that little space down there at the bottom and then pumping it through. So the water is always constantly flowing through the soil, so it more efficiently buffers your pH. So the things you will need to do these things. So to make your water, you're going to need a TDS meter. You need a test to test for pH. You need to test your GH and KH. You need to test for that. But I will say, I very rarely do that because if you make your water the same way every time, your GH and KH is always going to be the same. So as long as your RODI water is making, or your RODI unit is making water that's 0, maybe 1, maybe 2, but if your RODI unit is working good, so the thing you will be using the most is TDS because you remineralize your water to TDS, and so you will know that if you have RODI water, and you use the same B shrimp, salty shrimp remineralizer, if you remineralize and get the TDS up to a certain point, then you know your GH and KH will be the same. So I really don't use my GH, KH tests that much. And I will every great once in a while test for pH, especially if I think something is going wrong, but not very often. So mainly you're going to need a TDS meter. And when it comes to water changes, you really only need to change the water if your nitrate, you will need a nitrate test, starts getting above 5, close to 10. I just did my first water change on this setup this weekend, and I just changed the nitrate was getting a little bit above 5. So, but you do want nitrates. Talk about green walls. We'll get to that later. You need some nitrate, ammonia to make nitrate to get these green walls. So I had all that stuff right. I had all that figured out from the get-go. Making water's not hard. Testing's not hard. But what I didn't do right was food. Now, I feed my Neos, here's a Neo tank, my own blend of super high protein food, and they just breed like crazy. And I thought, well, if I feed the Caridina, these fancy tigers, the same thing, but just a little bit more, less amounts, I should be fine. Well, that is where I messed up, because if you think you're feeding not enough, or if you think you're feeding too much, you're feeding way, way, way too much. If you don't think you're feeding enough, you're probably still feeding too much when it comes to Caridina. And it comes down to food. So, this is what exclusively what I feed Shrimp Envy Food Fight. This stuff, this is all I've fed these guys since I started this tank, and I've had only success. I've tried a couple different foods, but these guys really need specific food, and food is not really their main diet. That's why I say you don't want to put too much food in. That is the absolute biggest killer for most people, because, like I said, getting the water parameters. I mean, some people might have troubles with that, but really it's not that hard. Now, this is the part where it's hard. Now, I only put in one little tiny piece of food twice a week. And I have like 30 adults in here and probably 40 or 50 little babies. Just little babies. But their main source of food comes from the biofilm and stuff growing on the glass, on the moss, on the outside of the filter. See all kinds of shrimp on the filter these days. But when it comes to Caridina, water quality is of the very, very, very utmost importance. And why things are different here is because this tank has a pH of like 7.8, 7.9. This tank has a pH of 5.5. Now, the different kinds of bacteria that grow in low pH and high pH are way, way, way different. There's way more beneficial bacteria. It is way, way easier to grow beneficial bacteria in hard water than it is in soft water. So that's why we really, really, really got to stay away from high protein foods that are densely, let's see, what's the word I'm thinking of? Caloric density, high caloric density is what I'm trying to think of. We don't want to put too much food in here. In fact, as long as you have green walls, you don't have to feed these guys at all. Now, I like to do it a little bit to get pictures and stuff. I just fed him yesterday, and I am going to show restraint. I'm not going to put a piece of food in here for this video. I'm just going to show you what they look like naturally without getting them all hoarded up at the front here with a piece of food, because that is the number one undoing, I think. Once you have all the basics down, the next thing you can really screw up is feeding too much or feeding the wrong thing. Because the bacteria, the nitrifying bacteria in soft water cannot handle that. You're going to end up with a bunch of bacterial infections and all kinds of other issues. That's what I had in my first setup. I was feeding way too much and I was feeding the wrong thing. And I kept getting sick. And then in my first setup, I realized that, and I just quit feeding it all together entirely. And they quit getting sick. They quit having issues. So that's, oh. So then when I did this new setup, I think we're getting to be about 2.5 months ago. When I did this setup, they immediately started having babies. There's a couple buried ones from the old setup, but the problem wasn't always getting the adults to live. It was getting the babies to live. That was always my problem because the water quality was not up to snuff. My pH was good, my TDS and all that was good, but I fed too much to the wrong things and had nothing but issues. That is a really good one. And I need to talk about leaves. Now, I think they will eat the leaves themselves, but mainly it's the organisms, the bacteria and stuff that are feeding on the leaves that the shrimp are eating. So you don't want to go overboard with leaves, but I always have a leaf in here, and then when that one started getting almost ate up, I put another one, and that one's getting ate up pretty fast. So that means there's tons of organisms in here, tons of biofilm, bacteria that's eating on the leaves, breaking down the leaves. The shrimp are feeding on the stuff that's eating on the leaves. And so this also, this UGF, acts as a filter, but you also want to have a sponge filter. Look at this. If you have one of these, you don't have to have one of these UGFs, but I look at this as just to buffer your soil, just to buffer your water, just for the soil to buffer the water more efficiently. This does a lot of filtration, but you want to look at your sponge as your main filter. Just look at all these little guys in here. This makes me so happy. Honestly, it does. I was to the point of giving up. I really was. And with the help of Leon, Shrimp Mania, Raffle at Crymore Shrimp, and Mark at Merc Shrimp Tanks, they're finally able to teach me some valuable lessons here to make these guys thrive. And I mean, having a Neo tank with lots and lots of shrimp is very, very rewarding. But these guys are, I want to say once you get a method figured out, it's not horribly hard, but finding your way can definitely be tricky. And here we are in the other room real quick. And now that I've figured them out and have a successful roadmap to follow, here's 50 pounds of Rio Escurio Brightwell for my next rack, which will be a rack of Caridina. So in this video, I went over some things and talked about some of the things that stood out to me as someone who is actually a professional neo breeder, but still figuring out Caridina. And if I missed anything, check out Mark from Mark Shrimp Tanks. Check this out. He is a real author now. He sells this as an ebook, but you can also get a hard copy like I have here on Amazon. So if there's still things you have questions about, go check out Mark's book, The Ultimate Guide to Breeding Caridina bee shrimp. So here's another huge tip. Now, you look at this tank. But look at this tank. Now this tank is a new tank. So when it cycles, the snails can get kind of crazy. In my own defense of snails, but you do not see a single flipping snail in here. The only life forms that you can see, every once in a while you'll see these little tiny copepods and shrimp. So like the biggest thing is limiting the amount of calories, the amount of anything that goes into this tank. You only want to put the smallest amount of input, and we only want the shrimpies eating our inputs. Now with Neos, it's all about, hey man, go natural. You got as many snails as you need. And this, it's a completely different ball game. You don't want anything else in here, in my opinion. It's all about the least amount of input and all the output going to making shrimp and green walls for the shrimpies, the baby shrimpies to feed on. All right. I really wanted to make sure I said that, and I realized I forgot to say it. So get your plants. I got these tissue cultures. When it comes to Caridina. Now, it's a completely different philosophy with Neos. So I just want to thank you guys for watching, and watch out, world. Neo Farmer figured out Caridina. Thanks again. Bye.